At dinner in the restaurant, I accidentally noticed a pregnant woman with a familiar appearance. When I looked up at her face, my heart seemed to stop beating. The daughter-in-law that my son said had run away 8 months ago. She saw me and immediately ran away, but when I followed to ask for the truth, I received an answer I couldn't believe. That answer exposed the truth I had been blind to for the past 8 months. Before I reveal the truth that shattered my world, please hit like, subscribe, and comment, where are you watching from today? Wherever you are, please take care of your health. Note: this is a fictional story crafted to explore betrayal and survival. The message carries genuine significance. Now let's continue. The pen felt like a lead weight in my hand, and for a second, the $2.3 million contract on the table blurred into a smear of black ink and expensive paper. I, Mitchell Stone, at 59 years old, felt the weight of my commercial construction empire pressing down on me as I sat in the dim light of Belmont's. The smell of expensive steak and floor wax usually signaled a win, but tonight, it only made the nausea clawing at my throat feel more real. My hands, which had once hoisted steel beams and laid the foundations for the city's tallest towers, were betraying me. A subtle tremor made the gold nib of the fountain pen dance over the signature line. It was a physical vulnerability I had spent months hiding, a recurring sickness that made the opulent Valentine's Day decor of the restaurant feel like a rotating carousel of red roses and mocking candlelight. Across the table, Gerald Thompson, my business partner of 20 years, sat watching me, his 55-year-old face etched with the impatience of a man who lived for the next zero on his bank statement. He shifted in his seat, his silk tie catching the light from the chandelier. "Mitchell, you have been staring at that line for 3 minutes," he said, his voice cutting through the hum of the dining room. "Is there a problem with the numbers?" I blinked, trying to force the swimming figures into alignment. "Just the lighting, Gerald," I managed to rasp, my voice sounding thin even to my own ears. "My eyes aren't what they used to be." I took a shallow breath, grounding myself by focusing on the cold, heavy weight of the pen. I was the king of Stone Enterprises, a man with $45 million in the bank. Yet I felt as though I were drowning in a glass of water. How could a man with $45 million in the bank feel like he was drowning in a glass of water? The room tilted slightly, the edges of the contract fraying into gray shadows. I needed to sign. I needed to finish this deal before the world completely dissolved into the floorboards. But then a rhythmic, heavy sound of footsteps approached. It wasn't the brisk, light-footed pace of the usual service staff. It was slow, deliberate, and carried a weary caution that made me look up. A waitress entered the periphery of our booth. She moved with a struggle that stood in stark contrast to the elegant diners surrounding us, her frame supporting a belly that looked far too heavy for her slender shoulders. I prepared to order a glass of water to clear my head, but as I raised my gaze, the air left my lungs. Hannah Vance, 25, looked like a ghost of her former self, in her stained apron, her 8-month pregnancy making every step a struggle. The woman my son Preston had sworn was a gold digger who had abandoned him for another man and disappeared forever was standing less than 3 feet away. Then I saw her. Not just a waitress. Her. My heart hammered a painful rhythm against my ribs, the dizziness replaced by a cold, piercing recognition that cut through the fog of my illness. "Good evening, gentlemen," she whispered, her voice trembling as she avoided direct eye contact. "Can I start you with some drinks while you look over the menu?" My hand tightened on the pen until the knuckles went white. "Water." I said the word, barely escaping my throat. Just ice water. The woman my son swore had left us for another man stood there 8 months pregnant and trembling, carrying a tray of water in a restaurant I owned half of. The glass of water she placed on the table trembled, sending ripples through my reflection that matched the frantic hammering in my chest. I sat paralyzed, my hand still clutching the gold fountain pen over a contract that suddenly felt like a piece of scrap paper. Hannah Vance stood there, the woman who had once been the bright, sharp-witted light of our family gatherings, now reduced to a ghost in a stained apron. Despite her obvious fear of being seen, she was the one who had approached the table, and as I looked into her hollow eyes, I realized she was either so blinded by exhaustion that she hadn't recognized me until she was inches away, or she was desperate for help she couldn't ask for aloud. My son Preston had spent months painting her as a villain who had fled to Europe with a lover, yet here she was, 8 months pregnant and serving salads to the very men who had supposedly been her victims. Gerald continued to drone on about interest rates and equity splits, his voice a distant hum that I completely ignored. He was oblivious to the fact that the runaway daughter-in-law he'd heard so much about was standing 3 inches from his elbow. I stared at her, searching for the vibrant woman who used to help me navigate the complexities of Stone Enterprises audits with effortless grace. Now her eyes were rimmed with a deep, bruised fatigue that no amount of sleep could fix. Hannah, I whispered the name, feeling heavy and strange on my tongue. Is that really you? Her gaze flicked to mine for a fraction of a second, filled with a mixture of raw terror and a pleading silence that broke my heart. I'm just the server, sir. She stammered, her voice a thin, reedy version of the one I remembered. Please, I'll get your salads right away. Now you have to understand, I spent 30 years building Stone Enterprises on the foundation of never walking away from a deal. But at that moment, the money felt like ash. I watched as her hands shook so violently that a silver fork clattered to the floor, the sharp ring of metal on marble drawing glares from the nearby socialites. She didn't even try to pick it up. She turned and began to hurry toward the swinging double doors of the kitchen, her heavy pregnancy making her gait uneven and visibly painful. The sight of her struggling, her pale knuckles white against the tray, sent a surge of protective rage through me that cleared the last of my dizziness. Mitchell, for God's sake, you look like you've seen a ghost. Gerald snapped, finally noticing my shattered composure. Are you having another one of your spells? We need to sign this, Mitchell. Look at the numbers. I looked at the $2.3 million deal and then at the kitchen doors where Hannah had vanished. She was a wounded bird, trying to fly in a hurricane of crystal chandeliers and judgmental whispers. I think I have seen a ghost, Gerald. I said, my voice vibrating with a sudden lethal clarity. Stay here. Don't follow me. I stood up physically, shoving the massive contract aside with a force that sent it sliding toward the edge of the table. I ignored Gerald's protests and the manager's startled cry of Mr. Stone as I broke the sacred boundary of the dining room. I pushed through the kitchen doors, the smell of expensive perfume replaced by a blast of humid heat, determined to catch the woman my son had left for dead. The swinging doors hit the wall with a bang, trading the refined scent of lilies and expensive wine for a wall of humid heat and the stinging stench of industrial degreaser. I stepped into the belly of the beast, my expensive Italian loafers slick on the tile floor, as I ignored the startled looks of the prep line and the hiss of steam from an industrial dishwasher. Tony, the 37-year-old head chef, who normally treated the kitchen like his personal kingdom, stepped back the moment he saw the look in my eyes. He started to protest, his mouth opening to defend his territory, but I cut him off before he could find his voice. Out of the way, Tony, I growled. I am not here for a health inspection. My eyes swept the stainless steel landscape past the barking orders and the clatter of pans until they landed on a shadowed corner by the prep station. Hannah stood there, hunched over her face, buried in her trembling hands. The sheer physical toll of this environment was staggering to witness. A woman in her 8th month of pregnancy standing for hours on slick floors while the stoves roared like furnaces. She had chosen the most high society restaurant in the city to vanish into a brilliant, desperate gamble that she could hide right under my son's nose. Hannah, look at me, I said, my voice softening as I reached her. This ends right now. She flinched as if I had struck her. her eyes darting around the kitchen with the frantic intensity of a trapped bird. She grabbed my arm and pulled me toward a dim, narrow hallway near the dry storage. The smell of burnt garlic and heavy grease clung to the air in the confined space. How do you tell a woman who is terrified of your own son that she is safe with you? I was the man who raised the monster she was running from. I looked at her fingers digging into my suit jacket, her grip fueled by pure, raw adrenaline. I saw it then. Not just fear. A total marrow-deep conviction that my son was the villain of her story. Preston said you left him for another man. I whispered the words, feeling like poison in my mouth. He told the family you were gone, Hannah. He said you took everything. She let out a frantic, breathy rasp that was half sob, half laugh. He'll take him, Mitchell. If he finds out about the baby, he'll take him, and I'll never see him again. Her voice was a ragged whisper against the backdrop of the kitchen's roar. She revealed that Preston hadn't just chased her away. He had actively threatened to have her declared mentally unfit, so he could take the child solely to secure the Stone inheritance line. My own son had weaponized the very family legacy I had spent my life building. I stood frozen, the cold, slick feeling of a stainless steel counter under my hand, the only thing keeping me upright as the foundation of my world collapsed. He didn't want a family. He wanted a bargaining chip. Please, if you ever loved me like a daughter, don't let him know I'm alive. She begged, her uneven breathing, the only sound in our dark corner. I looked at her, then back at the doors, realizing that every second we stood here, the monster I had created was just on the other side of the wood. The sound of Gerald calling my name from the dining room pulled me back to a reality that no longer mattered. I didn't even look back at the $2 million contract or my stunned partner. I simply moved my heavy overcoat catching on the chair as I lunged toward the service exit. The transition was a physical blow to my senses. I left behind the 72-degree ambiance of clinking crystal and hushed privilege charging through the kitchen where line cooks scattered like pigeons. Howard Bell, the 41-year-old manager with a permanent sneer for the underpaid, stepped into my path with a look of practiced concern. "Mr. Stone, sir, you can't be back here," he began, his voice oily with unearned authority. I didn't stop. I shoved past him, my shoulder connecting with his chest, just enough to send him stumbling into a prep table. "Save it for the lawyers, Gerald," I shouted back toward the dining room as the heavy metal door clanged shut behind me. The sudden sharp transition from the restaurant's warmth to the 28-degree Philadelphia winter hit me like a wall of ice. My lungs burned as I inhaled the frigid air, the opulent smells of Belmont's replaced instantly by the stench of garbage-wet cardboard and stale exhaust. I was effectively tanking the most important negotiation of the fiscal year, a $2 million deal that Gerald had spent months grooming, but as the wind whipped through my hair, the money felt like nothing more than paper scrap. For 30 years, I had been Mitchell Stone, the man who never left the table until the ink was dry. Tonight I was just a man chasing a ghost through the frost. How many times had I sat in that very restaurant eating $500 steaks while my grandson was being fed through a soup kitchen line? The thought was a jagged edge in my throat. I looked down the length of the narrow, lightless alleyway. There in the shadows, beside a rusted dumpster, I spotted a small, trembling silhouette huddled against the damp brick wall. It was Hannah. She was gasping for air, her thin cotton waitress uniform offering no protection against the winter chill. Her hands were clutched tightly over her swollen belly, her shoulders racking with silent, violent tremors. "Hannah, stop, please." "I'm not here to hurt you," I called out, my voice cracking as I stepped into the dim yellow glow of a single security light. She looked up, and the sight of her blue-tinged lips and chattering teeth made my stomach turn. "Mr. Stone, you shouldn't have followed me," she rasped, her voice a desperate, frozen whisper. "If he finds out, you don't know what he'll do. The lies didn't just have layers, they had teeth. "Hannah, look at me," I demanded, coming closer but keeping my hands visible. "Why are you out here? Why did Preston say you ran?" She let out a hollow, bitter sob that sounded like breaking glass. "He didn't just chase me away, Mitchell. He told the owners here, he told Howard, that I was a thief. He said I stole from the family. He wanted me to be watched even here. He wanted me to have nowhere to go." I felt a surge of lethal indignation. I pulled my own heavy wool coat off to wrap around her, but she flinched away with a sharp, instinctive jerk. Her eyes were wide with a terror so profound it suggested my son's cruelty went far beyond a few mean words. The look in Hannah's eyes wasn't just fear. It was the hollow, haunted expression of someone who had been methodically dismantled by the person they trusted most. As the winter wind bit into my face, she began to dismantle the lies my son Preston had used to poison my mind. Hannah's voice was a jagged, breaking sound as she finally admitted the psychological warfare that had turned my home into a domestic prison. It wasn't just the words, though his labels of worthless and gold digger had cut deep enough while she was working 60-hour weeks as a freelance accountant to pay for their mortgage. The real horror began with the gaslighting. She described how Brooke Sterling hadn't just appeared after Hannah left. Brooke was already there, moved into their guest room months prior, under the guise of being a business consultant. "Mitchell, he didn't just hit me!" She rasped, her chattering teeth sounding like dry bones. "He made me feel like I didn't exist in my own home." I stood near the metallic, sharp-smelling dumpster, nauseated by the betrayal. Brooke was already there. "While you were still living under that roof," I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The realization that I had raised a man capable of such cruelty felt like a physical weight pressing down on my lungs. My own blood. My own flesh. He was a stranger to me now. He wasn't just my son. He was a predator who had converted his own house into a siege. But the betrayal went even deeper. Brooke Sterling wasn't some stranger Preston had found in a bar. She was my own former junior associate, a woman I had personally fired for egregious ethics violations. Preston had secretly hired her back behind my back, bringing a wolf into the very heart of his home to devour his wife. Hannah detailed a living nightmare, where Brooke began wearing Hannah's clothes and jewelry while Hannah was still living there. They would sit in the dining room laughing as if she were a ghost, or a piece of furniture, openly discussing their future together. She wore my wedding anniversary dress to dinner in our own home. Hannah said, her white-knuckled fingers gripping her pregnant belly so hard I feared for the child. And my son, he just let this happen, he encouraged it. I asked, my righteous indignation boiling into a cold, lethal fury. They weren't just having an affair. They were conducting a slow-motion execution of Hannah's soul. Every story Hannah told stripped away another layer of the respect I once had for my own legacy. My son had spent my money to facilitate a domestic execution, and I had been too busy expanding Stone Enterprises to see the rot in my own foundation. I reached out to steady her, the biting sting of the wind, a distant annoyance compared to the fire in my chest. Hannah's voice dropped to a terrified whisper as she looked over my shoulder toward the restaurant door, her body going stiff with a fresh wave of panic. But Mitchell Brooke wasn't just there for the money. She set her eyes wide with a terror that suggested the worst was yet to come. She brought the powders. She said they were to help you retire early. A cold sweat that had nothing to do with the February wind broke across my neck as the word powders fell from Hannah's lips, snapping my own months of fatigue into a terrifying new focus. My world began to spin, not with the familiar vertigo I'd been battling, but with the nauseating clarity of a man realizing the roof he built is rigged to collapse. I realized in that heartbeat that my dizzy spells and the sudden unexplained lapses in my strength weren't the inevitable toll of aging or the stress of my empire. They were a design, Hannah's mention of Brooke bringing powders confirmed that I was being actively poisoned by the same monster who had dismantled her life. I reached out to steady her, but her knees buckled before my fingers could gain a purchase on her thin uniform. She slumped into the snow-dusted gravel of the alley,